She stood in the hallway of her own home, the home she had managed, decorated, and poured 40 years of her life into, and listened to a stranger read a dead man's will. She had expected grief. She had not expected this. The solicitor's voice was flat and unhurried, the way the voices of men are flat and unhurried when they are delivering a verdict they did not write and will not have to live with, and what it said was this: Cornelius Edmund Ashford, 5th Duke of Thornmere, had left his wife of 40 years, Elspeth, the woman standing on the pale grey Purbeck marble she had chosen herself, in a shop in Bath, in the 2nd year of their marriage, while he stood beside her and said the stone made the house look like a cloud that had decided to stand still, and she had laughed and thought, I will love this man for the rest of my life. Nothing. Not the house. Not the lands. Not a single chair. The servants were already moving. The trunks were already on the stairs. Percival Ashford, the Duke's nephew, stood at the far end of the hall with his solicitor and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing this morning for years and is finding it, at last, satisfyingly close to what he imagined. And Elspeth Ashford, Duchess of Thornmere, who had given 4 decades to this house and this man and this life, stood on her own marble floor and understood that she was now a stranger in it. But here is what Percival Ashford had not accounted for, and what Cornelius, God rest him, had spent 30 years too afraid to say out loud. There was a house in Yorkshire, and no one alive knew it existed. No one, that is, except the slight silver-haired gentleman now walking toward the gate with a sealed envelope in his hand. And everything, was about to change. Welcome to the Duke's shadow, where every secret has weight, and silence always has a cost. We are so glad you found us. Before the story goes any further, we need to hear from you. Drop it in the comments right now. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? If this story is already moving you, please like this video and subscribe to the Duke's Shadow. More breathtaking Victorian romance stories are coming, and you will not want to miss a single one. Elspeth did not break. She had learned, in 40 years of marriage to a man who kept everything behind glass, that the cruelest thing one can do to those who intend to humiliate you is to refuse them the satisfaction of witnessing it. Her fingers, inside black mourning gloves, pressed together until the knuckles ached beneath the fabric. That was all. Outside, her composure was marble. Inside, it was something else entirely, a cold, specific fury of the kind that does not burn hot and extinguish itself. The kind that finds its shape over years, becomes useful, and waits. Because she was not merely a grieving widow being treated badly. She was a 62-year-old woman who had managed this estate through floods, through financial crises, through Cornelius's long silences and longer absences, through 3 losses she had carried alone because the era she lived in did not permit a duchess to be visibly undone. She had done all of it with grace and without complaint. And this man, this nephew with his pale hands and his wet slate eyes, was standing in her hallway in front of her servants, reading her out of her own life. Very well. She would find what Cornelius had failed to sign away. And she already knew, though she could not yet have said how she knew, that he had left her something. He had just been too afraid in life to give it to her directly. Her trunk was small. Black leather, brass-latched, the size of a careful life reduced to what cannot be taken. Her mother's garnet brooch. A leather journal. A miniature portrait of Cornelius painted in the 1st year of their marriage. Young, open, not yet fully retreated behind the composure that would eventually become his primary residence. And the grey wool shawl she had worn the evening he first told her he loved her, in a lamplit garden in Bath 39 years ago. She carried the trunk herself, because she was damned if she would ask a single person in that house for assistance, and she walked through the front door without looking back, without looking at the portraits, without looking at the marble, without giving Percival Ashford the backward glance that would have told him she felt the leaving. She descended the stone steps in the November rain. She walked the gravel drive with her spine straight and her chin level, and the cold rain finding the back of her neck above the morning collar. And the iron gate swung shut behind her with a sound that those who have lost everything will recognize. Not a bang, not a crash, but a soft, precise, terrible click. The sound of a chapter ending without a resolution. She stood at the gate with her trunk on the wet gravel and she breathed. She was 62. She had no house. She was also, she noted, still standing. She intended to continue standing until she understood what Cornelius had been trying to tell her from his deathbed, for nights before he died, in a voice so low she had leaned close to hear it, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath on her face, which was, she realized now, the nearest they had been in years. 4 nights before he died, Cornelius had opened his eyes in the way that illness sometimes permits. A return of clarity so specific and so temporary that it feels almost cruel, a parting of fog to show you, briefly, what has always been behind it. He had looked at her with the gaze she first saw from a doorway in Bath, direct, unguarded, no glass between them. And he had said, in a voice she had to lean so close to receive that she could feel the warmth of it against her cheek, that last warmth she would ever feel from him, "Elspeth, forgive me. There is something in Yorkshire I have never had the courage to show you." She had pressed his hand. She had said, "Rest, my love, we shall speak of it when you are better." My love. She had not said it in years, and she had said it now, at the end, and he had heard it, she was certain he had heard it. He had not become better. They had not spoken of it. He had taken his explanation into the ground with him, inside his carefully composed, privately tormented chest, along with everything else he had never been able to give her. And she had been turned out of her home with a single trunk and a dead man's unfinished sentence. She looked at the house one last time, its amber windows glowing for a new master, indifferent, beautiful, and gone, and then she turned away, and the silver-haired gentleman was at the gate, his coat dark with rain, his expression carrying the patient gravity of a man who has been waiting for this specific moment for 30 years. "Your Grace," he said, "my name is Mr. Aldous Croft, and the Duke left you something he could not bring himself to register. But he left it to you, and I am here to make certain you receive it." The rain came down between them. Elspeth looked at him for one long moment. Then she said, "You had better start from the beginning. Before we can understand what Mr. Croft carries in that envelope, before we can understand the secret Cornelius took to his grave, we have to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the summer of 1851, and a morning in Bath, and a book that fell at precisely the wrong moment. Or, as Elspeth would come to understand, precisely the right one. To understand everything, the house in Yorkshire, the 30 years of silence, the secret Cornelius carried to his death, you have to understand how it began. Because it began not with deception, not with calculated betrayal, but with a dropped book and a man who looked back from a doorway when he did not have to. Bath in the summer of 1851. The pump room on a Tuesday morning, the light through the tall windows and long golden columns, the air carrying that particular mineral sweetness of sulfur and rose water and warm stone. Elspeth Vane was 22, the eldest daughter of Sir Alistair Vane of Devonshire, a man whose title was respectable and whose means were not, and she was genuinely reading a small volume of Virgil tucked behind her program, which was the sort of thing that made her mother look anxious and most young men in the room look elsewhere. She was not beautiful in the current fashion, too dark, too direct, too liable to disagree, but she had the particular attraction of a person entirely themselves, which is rarer and more compelling than any fashionable prettiness, and which tends to act on the right kind of man, like a lamp acts on a moth. She had not come to Bath to find that man. She was reading Virgil. And then the Duke of Thornmere walked in, and the room changed, and nothing that happened afterward was ever quite as simple as it should have been. He came in at 10:30 and the room changed. Not loudly, Cornelius did nothing loudly, but the way a room changes when a fire is lit. A shift in attention, a collective orientation. He was 35, broad-shouldered, dark-haired with silver at his temples, and he moved through the pump room with the unhurried gravity of a man who has never needed to consider whether he belongs anywhere. He spoke to no one. He would have left without incident, without consequence, without this story, had Elspeth not dropped her book. The Virgil struck the floor between them with a sound that cut across the room's conversation. He stopped. His secretary moved to retrieve it. But Cornelius was already bending, smoothly, without ceremony, and he lifted the book himself and looked at the open page and looked up at her, and in his expression was something she would not see again for months and would spend years learning to find: genuine surprise. The kind that slips past even the most disciplined composure. The kind that means you have encountered something you did not expect and were not armored against. "You read Virgil?" he said. Not a compliment. A statement of discovery. I read everything, she replied, meeting his eyes, not looking away, not adjusting herself for his rank or his attention. And the silence that followed was the kind that happens between two people who have just exchanged more information than the words they used. He walked to the door. And then he stopped and looked back. She did not look away first. He did. Everything that followed began with that look. He called on her family 2 days later. He appeared at the assembly rooms at Sydney Gardens, at the pump room on 4 consecutive mornings, always arriving at precisely the time she was present, never acknowledging this by word or expression. His courtship was unlike anything she had encountered. No flattery, no performance, no calculated charm. What he offered was conversation, long, serious, occasionally combative exchanges about literature and history and the obligations of land ownership, in which he listened to her with focused attention and pushed back when he disagreed, which she found startling and then genuinely invigorating. He argued with her. He listened to her argue back. He looked at her, when she made a point he found interesting, with the expression of a man who has not expected to be interested and is finding it inconveniently pleasant. And on a lamplit evening in the 3rd week, walking in the garden of her aunt's house on Gay Street, he stopped and said, with a direct simplicity that was native to him, as though sentiment were just another subject to be addressed honestly, Miss Vane, I find myself wishing to marry you. I am better at argument than romance and I am aware of it. But I would offer you my name, my home, my complete fidelity and, I should tell you plainly, my heart, which I had considered a settled question until approximately 10 days ago. She looked at him in the lamplight and felt something warm and permanent click into place. Yes, she said. She did not yet know, could not yet know, that the heart he was offering her was not the whole of what he carried. That there was a part of him already given to someone else. That the first letter he wrote on their wedding night was not to her. The wedding was at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a pale April morning with white roses along the pews and sunlight precisely placed, as it sometimes is on such mornings, with deliberate generosity. Ivory silk. Lily of the valley. And Cornelius, placing the ring on her finger, holding her hand one moment after the ceremony required, a small, private extension that only she would feel, and which told her more than the vows. That evening, when the guest had finally gone and the candles burned low and the house was at last theirs in the particular silence that belongs to two people alone in a space that is now their life, Cornelius kissed her on the forehead and said he had a letter he must write. Urgent, could not wait, would not take long. She had thought nothing of it. Men of affairs wrote letters. She was warm with champagne and happiness and the particular soft dazzlement of a woman who has just married a man she believes she understands completely. She was passing the study not 20 minutes later when the door stood a half-inch open, and she saw, purely by accident in an unrepeatable instant, the address on the envelope on his writing table. A name she did not know. A house she had never heard of. In the North Riding of Yorkshire. She forgot it almost immediately. She would not forget it again. That forgotten address was the first thread of the thing that would unravel her life 40 years later. And she had walked past it that night in her wedding dress. She had been the happiest woman in England that April. She had been 23 years old and married to a man she loved and moving into a house she was already reimagining as a home, and the only darkness in any of it was a single glimpsed address on a single evening that she chose, reasonably and entirely humanly, not to pursue. Who among us would have done differently? Who, on their wedding night, would have opened that door, picked up that letter, and demanded an explanation from the man they had just married? She had trusted him. She had believed in him. And for a long time, a longer time than she would ever admit to anyone, that trust had felt justified. He was a good husband in the ways that mattered to the visible world. He was faithful in his manner, generous in his provision, and present enough that the absences, when they came, could always be explained away. But there was a locked room on the 3rd floor of Thornmere House. And a child's booty hidden in a book no one read. And every October, without fail, without exception, for 40 years, he left. And now, standing in the rain outside the house she no longer owned, with a silver-haired solicitor at her side and a sealed envelope in his hand, Elspeth Ashford finally understood that she had spent 40 years in a marriage with a floor she had never been allowed to reach. She was about to reach it now. She had trusted him. But trust, in a house full of locked rooms, is a luxury the walls cannot always afford. Because Thornmere House was keeping a secret. It had been keeping it since before Elspeth arrived. And the clues, when she looks back, were always there. In the early years she was happy. Let that be said plainly, because it matters, because the story is not simply the story of a betrayal but of a real marriage with real warmth inside it, and without the warmth the betrayal means nothing. She made Thornmere House into a home, the way warm-natured people do. Instinctively, incrementally, by moving furniture to face the garden and replacing gray hangings with garnet damask and filling the east corridor with flowers where none had stood for a generation. Cornelius noticed. He was not a man of direct compliment, but she saw the change in him when she had arranged a room, the fractional ease of his shoulders, the faint pride in his manner when guests praised what she had done. Once, he came upon her rearranging miniature portraits in the drawing room, flushed, absorbed, her hair coming loose from its pins, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression so entirely unguarded that she felt seen in a way she had not felt seen since Bath. "It is better," he said quietly. She thought he meant the room. And perhaps he did. But there was something else in his face, something that lived beneath the composure, a quality she could not name, a weight he carried so naturally that she had almost stopped noticing it was there. Almost. Because there was a door on the third floor that no one opened. And that door, she would one day understand, was where the weight lived. It announced itself on a Tuesday in October, the month he always left, and it did so in the way that consequential things do. Not dramatically, but with a small, specific wrongness that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. A housemaid had misdirected a new footman into the third floor's east passage. Elspeth heard the confusion through two walls, the maid's swift, hushed correction, the footman's retreating steps, and then that particular silence, the kind that follows the sudden understanding that something has nearly been done that must not be done. She went to see. The door was plain oak, brass-fitted, unremarkable, no different from 30 others in this house, except for what surrounded it. No rug. No lamp bracket. No dust on its sill, while the passage around it wore November's fine gray film. Someone cleaned this door. Alone. Deliberately. At intervals no one else knew. She put her hand flat to the wood and felt nothing. No warmth, no sound, nothing. She looked at the lock. She was a woman of self-possession and intelligence, and she was married to a man she loved, and the door was locked, and she had never in her life wanted so badly to do something she had decided absolutely not to do. She turned and walked away. Her hands were unsteady. She had been married 3 years. That was the first time her hands were unsteady in this house. It would not be the last. She asked him that evening, directly, calmly, in the manner she had learned was the only language he genuinely respected. "There is a room on the third floor that is locked and tended separately from the rest of the house. I should like you to tell me what it contains." He was reading by the fire. He always read after dinner, holding the book slightly angled toward the light, running one thumb along the margin as he read, a habit she found endearing, this man who kept his place in two senses at once. He did not look up immediately. The pause before he did was exactly one beat too long to be natural, and they both knew it and neither said so. When he raised his eyes his expression was composed in the way of a man holding something at a deliberate distance. Not coldness, but containment. "A storeroom," he said. "Legal documents. Nothing requiring your attention." She held his gaze. "I see," she said. He returned to his book. She returned to her embroidery. The fire crackled between them in the warm room. And something cold moved through it and settled, and neither of them spoke for the rest of the evening. But once, just once, she looked up from her needlework and found him not reading but watching her, with an expression on his face that stopped her breath. Raw and unguarded and full of something that was not guilt exactly but older than guilt, closer to grief, the expression of a man who has done something he cannot undo and is watching, every day, the person who does not yet know. He looked back at his book at once. But she had seen it. She would never entirely unsee it. Mrs. Harriet Dunmore had been housekeeper at Thornmere for 22 years when Elspeth arrived, and she was the house's memory, stout, gray-haired, firm in her opinions and gentle in their expression, possessed of a knowledge so deep and long that without her the house would have lost its own continuity. She received Elspeth in that first week with a warmth Elspeth found unexpected and sustaining, and their friendship, careful, correct, but real in the way enduring things become real, had grown over years through the particular trust that forms between two women managing the same household under the authority of the same man. Once, in the 5th year of the marriage, when Elspeth had paused before the locked door somewhat longer than she intended, Mrs. Dunmore passed behind her with linens and said, without stopping, without looking at her, in a voice so low it was nearly breath, "His Grace carries something heavy, Your Grace. He has carried it since long before you arrived. Nothing more. Just that." And Elspeth had understood that this was all she would be given, that Mrs. Dunmore, loyal to both of them in different and incompatible ways, had said the most she could say. She had filed it away. She had done what women of her era were trained to do with inconvenient knowledge. She had been gracious and continued and said nothing. 12 years into their marriage, on a gray October afternoon, Cornelius gone north as he always was in October, the house quiet in the specific hollow way it was always quiet in his absence, she found it. She was searching the lower library shelves for a mislaid Wordsworth when a heavy natural history volume shifted in her hand and something fell from between its pages and landed on the turkey carpet with a soft, almost inaudible sound. She looked down. She could not, for a moment, make sense of what she saw. Then she could. A child's booty. Blue velvet. Small enough to sit in her palm. A ribbon fastening dried to brittleness. It had been placed here, not forgotten, placed, in a book no one read, on a shelf no one visited, in a house of rooms too large and silences too many. She sat on the library floor for a very long time and held it. And she thought, I have shared a house and a name and a life and a bed with this man. I have lost 3 children and told him and watched him hold my hand. And still, there are rooms in him I have not been permitted to enter. The booty was the size of a question she had been afraid to ask for 12 years. She put it back between the pages. She replaced the book. She went upstairs and she wept, alone behind a closed door, for all 3 of her losses and for his, and for every mile of distance that passes for marriage when 2 people are too afraid of the truth to cross it. And she dried her eyes. And she went down to dinner. And she said nothing, because she was a Victorian Duchess, and that is what Victorian Duchesses did. But something had shifted in her that afternoon. Some last piece of patience, some final willingness to pretend she did not see what she saw. And in the years that followed she began, quietly and without announcement, to watch him more carefully. She was watching him. She had been watching him for years. And the more carefully she watched, the more clearly she understood that the man she had married was not one man but 2, and that the second one only existed for 10 days every October. On a moor in Yorkshire. In a house no one else knew about. Every October. Without exception. For 40 years. The first Wednesday of the month, a trunk was packed, Briggs was summoned, the carriage was brought round, and Cornelius Ashford left for the north. He returned on the second Friday looking rested, not tired from travel, not relieved to be home, but rested, in the particular way of a person who has spent 10 days somewhere that does not require them to be careful. Elspeth noted this. She noted it the 2nd year and the 3rd year and every year after. She filed it carefully in the ledger of things she observed and did not speak of, which was a very large ledger by the time she was 30, and positively encyclopedic by the time she was 60. She had stopped asking where he went after the 2nd year, because his answers were correct in the manner of a man who has prepared them, and she was too intelligent to find that satisfying and too proud to let him see that she was not satisfied. She managed Thornmere in his absence and welcomed him home on his return and carried the absence the way she carried all the other unanswerable things in her life, quietly, fully, and with a dignity that cost her something every single time. 40 absences. 40 returns. And in all of that, in those 400 days he spent somewhere she was not permitted to know about, she had never once, not once, asked him to choose. That restraint, she understood now, standing in the rain outside her lost home, had been the central mistake of her life. But there had been the garden. There had been one specific evening in the summer of their 23rd year when she had nearly believed everything was going to be all right, when the distance between them had narrowed to something she could almost reach across. They were walking in the walled garden at dusk, the June roses at their fullest and the air warm with the particular sweetness of an evening that has decided to be perfect. And Cornelius stopped at the old stone bench and sat, and she sat beside him, and he reached across and took her hand. Not with ceremony. Not with the deliberateness of a man making a gesture. Simply, the way you reach for something that belongs naturally in your grasp. They sat without speaking for a long time, listening to the swifts overhead and the last of the evening light going gold on the stone walls, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand, of the way his thumb moved once, slowly, across her knuckles, barely, as though he was not certain he intended it. And she felt, in that moment, the enormous and heartbreaking distance between this man and his own heart, not because he was cold but because he was so warm and so unable to show it that the warmth had turned inward and become a kind of pain. "You have been better to me than I have deserved," he said at last. "I have known it always." She opened her mouth. The right words were there, present, ready, and his hand tightened briefly on hers. And then he stood and said he had a letter to write before dark, and he walked back across the garden, and the evening closed behind him like water over a stone. She sat on the bench for a very long time after he had gone. She did not call him back. She had learned, by their 23rd year, not to call him back. In the October of their 31st year he came home early. A Tuesday, not a Friday, which had never happened before in 30 years of October returns, and when he came through the door he did not go to his study as he always went to his study. He came to the sitting room. He sat down in the chair by the window and looked at her as though he had arrived at the beginning of a sentence he had not yet found the end of. She set down her pen. They were alone. The lamp was low. His hands on the arms of the chair were not quite still. That was new. Cornelius's hands were always still. Something was working behind his eyes, urgent, specific, the pressure of a decision being made in real time. She thought, now. This is when he says it. Whatever it is. No. And she felt, beneath the wariness, beneath 40 years of careful management, the same terrifying, involuntary hope she had felt in a garden in Bath 30 years ago, when a man had looked back from a doorway. Then a footman knocked with the evening post. Cornelius took it, and the moment closed. Like a door. Like a room with a lock. He read his letters. She picked up her pen. The lamp burned between them and neither of them spoke, and she pressed her feet flat to the floor beneath her skirts, quietly, invisibly, the way you press on a bruise to determine whether the tenderness has passed. It had not. It would not. There would be no more evenings like this one. In 9 years he would be dead. And she would still not know. The cruelest thing he ever did to her, kinder by intention than anything Percival ever managed and more damaging for it, was the key. She found it the morning after the sitting-room evening, small, iron, old-fashioned, on the silver tray of her dressing table where the previous evening there had been only her comb and her mother's brooch. She did not touch it immediately. She sat before her mirror and looked at it and felt, moving through her chest like cold water, the recognition of what it was. The lock on the third-floor door had lived in her memory with precise measurement for 30 years. This key was the right size. He had placed it here, placed it deliberately while she was at breakfast, walked up to her room and laid it on her tray, and the placing of it was the closest he had ever come, in 31 years of marriage, to opening the door himself. She dressed. She poured her tea. She did not go upstairs. She waited, with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that some gifts are tests and some tests are gifts and some are simply the gesture of a man who wants to give something and cannot quite close the last distance between the wanting and the giving. She returned to her room 2 hours later. The key was gone. Mrs. Dunmore told her that afternoon, with a steadiness that spoke of deliberate measurement. "His Grace came through your room at 9:30, Your Grace." Only briefly. That evening at dinner Cornelius was precisely himself. Aunt Elspeth looked at him across the table and loved him with the specific, magnificent exhaustion of a woman who has spent 30 years loving a man who puts the key on the tray and then takes it back again. He died in November. 9 years after the sitting-room evening and 8 years after the key. He died in the bedroom he had occupied for 60 years, in the grey Wiltshire light, with the smell of the last of the autumn roses from the garden she had made coming through the window. She had sat beside him through the final days, and she had talked to him about the garden, the village, the book she was reading, the way one talks to someone who is retreating and must be given something to follow. On the fourth night he had opened his eyes with the sudden clarity that the very ill sometimes find at the end, a final parting of the fog, and he had looked at her the way he had looked at her from the doorway of the pump room in Bath 39 years ago. Direct, unguarded, no glass between them. And he had said, in a voice so small she had to lean close enough to feel his breath warm on her face, which was the last time she would feel it, "Elspeth, forgive me. There is something in Yorkshire I have never had the courage to show you." And she had said, "Rest, my love, we shall speak of it when you are better." My love. She had said it. It had been years since she had said it. He died 2 days later without speaking again. He had carried the secret, the key, the locked room, the October absences, the blue booty, and the address in Yorkshire into the ground with him. And now Elspeth stood in the rain outside her lost home with a silver-haired solicitor beside her who had been waiting 30 years to speak, and she understood, fully, finally, with the complete clarity of a woman who has run out of patience for incomplete sentences, that the story her husband had been unable to tell her in life, she was going to hear now. Mr. Aldous Croft had been keeping Cornelius Ashford's deepest secret for 30 years. He had been waiting, specifically, for this day. And what he carried in that leather case was not merely a deed or a letter. It was the entire hidden architecture of a man's life, and the thing that was about to change everything. The White Hart at Thornton Underwood was a coaching inn of the old kind, thick walls, low ceilings, fireplaces that understood their purpose, staff who recognized quality without making a performance of recognizing it. The innkeeper's wife produced tea and cold beef without being asked and withdrew with the discretion of a woman who had managed distressed gentlewomen before and understood that the appropriate service was invisibility. Elspeth sat in the armchair by the fire and did not drink the tea. She looked at the rain on the window until the rain and her own reflection became the same gray surface, and she did the thing she had spent 40 years learning to do in rooms where no one was watching. She let herself feel it. The full weight of the morning. The reading of the will. The servants looking away. The trunk in her hands. The gate clicking shut. 62 years old. No house. No income. One trunk, one brooch, one shawl, and a dead man's unfinished sentence. She breathed. She pressed her feet flat to the floor. Old habit, old anchor, and she thought, I have survived 40 years of that man's silences. I'm not done surviving. Then Mr. Croft knocked and she said, "Come in," and the story walked back through the door. Whatever came next, she was ready. She had been ready in one way or another for 30 years. Mr. Aldous Croft was 64, with the face of a man whose profession had been discretion for so long that discretion had become physiognomy. Mild, forgettable in company, but in private possessed of a sharpness of eye that indicated a mind which had kept consequential things for many years without once setting them down carelessly. He had served, he explained, as the Duke's private solicitor, retained entirely separately from Mr. Renwick, who managed the family and public estate, for 30 years for the purpose of a single, specific, ongoing matter. Engaged personally by Cornelius Ashford in the autumn of 1861, with instructions that upon the Duke's death he was to present himself to the Duchess, alone, before any consequence of the public will could be made permanent. He had received word of the Duke's death on the morning of the funeral, come directly, stood at the back of the church and watched the coffin go in, stood at the gate and watched Elspeth walk out with her single trunk and her straight spine, and followed her here, because 30 years of faithful service to a man of complicated conscience had brought him at last to the moment when faithful service became something more like justice. He owed Cornelius loyalty. He owed Elspeth the 30 years of truth Cornelius had been too afraid to deliver himself. He intended to give her both in the correct order. "Your Grace," he said, opening his case, "there is a property, and a letter, and a great deal you have not been told." He produced 2 documents. The first was a deed of transfer, formally drawn, properly witnessed, bearing the Duke's seal in dark red wax, conveying the property known as Velmora Hall, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, house and all acreage and outbuildings and contents, to the Duchess Elspeth Ashford in her own name, absolutely and without condition. It was dated November 1861. 30 years ago. She looked at it in silence for a long moment. 30 years. For 30 years this deed had existed, signed, sealed, witnessed, and had sat in Mr. Croft's leather case instead of in the land registry, because Cornelius had intended to register it and had never quite done so, had scheduled it and deferred it and scheduled it again, had found every year some reason why this was not quite yet the moment, until the moments had accumulated into a decade and then 2 and then 3, and then he had died and left it and signed and unregistered and therefore legally precarious, which was, Elspeth thought, looking at the document with a stillness that felt like the stillness before a long-held breath is released, the most Cornelius thing she had ever heard. He had wanted to give her something. He had wanted to give her this. And in his specific, costly way, he had managed to want it for 30 years without quite crossing the last distance between the wanting and the giving. The second document in Mr. Croft's case was a letter, sealed in dark red wax, addressed in that angular script she knew at 20 paces, Elspeth. He asked me to give you this myself, Mr. Croft said, and to remain until you had read it. She took it. It was heavier than 4 pages had any right to be. She read it without looking up. The letter was 4 pages, the handwriting pressed harder than usual, the way a hand presses when it is making a confession it has been postponing for 30 years. He apologized specifically, not in the ambient, general way of men who apologize for everything without cost, but itemized as Cornelius did all things, which made it considerably worse. For the locked room. For the key placed and taken back. 440 Octobers managed by her in silence. For the 3 losses she had carried without adequate companionship because he had not known how to offer it without revealing everything else. For the booty in the library, he knew she had found it, he knew she had replaced it without a word, and that act of grace shamed him more than anything he had ever done. He wrote, "There is a woman at Velmora Hall named Rosalind Farrow, and a young man named Edmund, and you have a right to know of them, and I have failed you by not telling you myself." And on the last page, alone, a sentence she read and then held still with for a long time. "I loved you in the manner of a man who never learned to love without a shadow. But I loved you, Elspeth, completely. That part was never a lie." She folded the letter. She placed it inside her coat, against her chest. She looked at Mr. Croft. "We need to move quickly," she said. "Someone in that corridor has been listening for the past 20 minutes. Mr. Croft did not flinch. "I know," he said. "I heard him too." They looked at each other. "Then we leave before dawn," said Elspeth. "And we do not take the main road." Through the window of the inn room, across the wet road, in the shelter of a doorway that offered rain protection to someone standing very still and very deliberately. A man. Collar raised. Face angled not away from the rain but toward her window. Not sheltering. Watching. With the specific, practiced stillness of someone being paid to wait and competent at the waiting. She had seen him before. Once at Thornmere House, in Percival's company at a dinner she had managed 2 years ago. Once near the stables at an hour that had no legitimate explanation. He had been following her since the reading of the will. Which meant Percival already knew she had not gone back to Wiltshire. Which meant Percival was already calculating what she might do next, and with whom, and in which direction. She turned from the window. Her hands were steady. Her mind was already on the road north. "Mr. Croft," she said, "how long is the journey to Yorkshire?" 14 hours in this rain by private carriage. Perhaps 12 if the roads clear toward morning. She nodded. "Then there is a woman at Velmora Hall named Rosalind Farrow who has been waiting 30 years for someone to arrive and ask the right questions." She picked up her tea, cold now, untouched, and drank it in one deliberate swallow, the way one takes medicine one has been putting off. Let us not keep her waiting any longer. And whatever Yorkshire held, whatever secret Cornelius had been too afraid to name, whatever Rosalind Farrow had been tending in that hall on the edge of the moor for 32 years, Elspeth Ashford was going north. Before dawn. In the dark. And nothing and no one was going to stop her. 14 hours to Yorkshire. 14 hours for Elspeth to sit in a dark carriage and think about a man she had loved for 40 years and a woman she had never met and a secret that had been living in a house on the edge of the moor while she was living in Wiltshire, managing his house, carrying his name, and waiting for him to be brave enough to tell her the truth. They left before the village woke, in the hour when darkness still has substance and the rain had thinned to a cold mist lying against the road like something that has not yet decided whether to stay. Mr. Croft had arranged a carriage from a livery 2 villages over, an account he had maintained for exactly such contingencies, through 30 years of a practice built around the principle that discreet men plan for the moment when discretion is no longer sufficient and speed becomes the thing. The carriage waited in the back lane without lamps. They moved through the empty village at walking pace, 2 people returning home after a late evening, not 2 people escaping toward a confrontation with a dead man's secrets, and Elspeth kept her eyes on the doorway across from the inn as they passed it. Empty. The watcher had gone, which meant one of 2 things. He had gone to sleep or he had gone to report. She gave herself 6 hours before Percival knew the direction. 6 hours was enough. The carriage turned north on the London road and gathered pace in the dark, and Elspeth sat back against the seat and felt something she had not felt in 3 days, the sensation of moving toward something rather than away from it. She noticed, with mild and genuine surprise, that this sensation suited her. That after 40 years of managing and enduring and waiting, moving, actually physically, purposefully moving, felt like something she had been made for and had simply not been permitted to do. England changed around them as they went north, and Elspeth watched it with the attention of a woman who prefers to anchor her thinking to what she can see when what she is thinking is too large to look at directly. The soft managed prettiness of the south gave way to something harder and more honest. The Midlands flat and grey under the November sky, the hedgerows thicker and less tended, the villages more self-contained, less concerned with their own appearance. Then the land began to rise. The stone grew darker. The walls ran dry, built up the hillsides. The sky pressed closer to the earth, not oppressively but with the specific intimacy of a country that does not bother to perform. She thought of him on this road. 30 years of Octobers, this same turn north, this same sky opening above him, this same country receiving him. She thought of his face when he returned, that rested quality, that specific softness she had noted and said nothing about. She had always attributed it to relief at the conclusion of an obligation. She understood now it was its opposite. It was the peace of a man who has been for 10 days entirely himself, not performing, not withholding, not maintaining the distance between his heart and his public face that his life required of him every other day of the year. He had been rested because he had been real. And she had been in Wiltshire, managing his house and carrying his name, not knowing that somewhere on a moor in Yorkshire, the real Cornelius was sitting by a fire with people who knew the whole of him. That thought she decided she would feel later, when she had time, when the immediate business was concluded. "Tell me about Velmora," she said, when they were past Birmingham and the dark had given way to a grey November morning of flat light and bare trees. Mr. Croft told her. 60 acres, North Riding Moor, 3 miles from Helmsley, a stone manor built in the reign of Charles II, compact and well-maintained, continuously occupied since 1859. A small staff, housekeeper, 2 maids, a cook, a groundsman, all long-tenured, all paid quarterly through the private account he had administered. A resident. He called her the caretaker, using the term the Duke had employed in correspondence, and Elspeth heard the deliberate blankness with which he applied it, the word functioning as a door, not a description, and understood that behind it lived the name she had been waiting since last night to hear properly. Rosalind Farrow. Approximately 50. 32 years at Velmora. A son, Edmund, 28, raised at Velmora, recently in London reading law. That was the extent of Mr. Croft's official knowledge. Then he paused, in the manner of a man reaching the boundary between what he has been told and what he has understood, and said, "In the final year of his life, the Duke wrote to Edmund directly. A personal letter, the first in his own name rather than through my offices. He told me he had sent it. He used the word relief. That was the only time in 30 years of acquaintance that I heard him use that word." Elspeth looked out at the grey fields. A relief. She thought of the sitting-room evening, the not quite said thing, the moment that closed like a door. He had finally done one of the things he had always meant to do. Only one. The other he had left for her to do herself. She had been working toward the question since the inn, shaping it, testing it, trimming it down to its essential weight. Does she know about me? Not what does she want? Not what is her claim? Simply, does she know? Mr. Croft regarded her with a long, thoughtful stillness. She has always known, he said. From the first year. He told her. He wrote to her about you over the years. The carriage moved through the morning. She absorbed this. He had written about her. On those October evenings she had spent alone at Thornmere, managing the household, reading by the fire, pressing her feet to the floor in the sitting room and waiting for him to come back and say the thing he never said. He had been writing to Rosalind Farrow about his wife. What did he say? Very quietly. Mr. Croft paused for only a moment. He said you were the finest person he knew, and that the distance between what he owed you and what he had given you was the thing that would not let him rest. The carriage was quiet for a long time after that. The moors opened on either side. The light went flat and wide. He told her I was the finest person he knew, Elspeth said at last, and he could not find the words to say it to me directly. No, said Mr. Croft, with the gentleness of a man who has spent 30 years watching a good man fail at exactly this. He could not. Outside, the first of the Yorkshire stone walls appeared in the grey morning light. Long, straight, running up the hillside like a sentence someone started and never finished. She watched them pass. She thought, we're almost there. And she was not afraid. The road wound up onto the higher moor as the afternoon came on, and the country became something simultaneously harder and more beautiful. The moorland grasses silver pale where the winter light caught them, the stone walls running straight and purposeful up the hillsides. The air coming through the carriage seemed cold and clean in a way that felt, oddly, like honesty. Like a place that does not pretend to be warmer than it is. She was thinking about what she would say, had been thinking about it in one form or another since Bath, though she had not known it then. Had been composing the sentence for 39 years, had simply not known for whom it was intended until now. She would say, I am not here to take anything from you. She would say, I only want to understand. She would say, and this, she thought, was the truest of the three, I spent 40 years married to a man I loved and I was not given the full picture and I deserve the full picture and I have driven through the night in the rain to come and get it, and I would appreciate it if no one made that more difficult than it already is. The carriage turned down a long stone-walled lane. At the end of it, in the dark, 3 sets of windows glowed amber through the moorland night like a lantern held up against the cold. Velmore Hall. The house that should have been hers 30 years ago. The house where the other half of her husband's life had been lived. The lamp at the gate was already lit, as though someone inside had been watching the road. As though someone had been expecting her. As though, in fact, someone had been waiting for this night for a very long time. Elspeth looked at the lit windows and said nothing. She straightened her spine and smoothed her gloves and stepped out of the carriage into the cold Yorkshire night. She had come a long way. She intended to go further. The lamp was lit. The door opened. And standing in the doorway with a lamp in her hand was the woman who had loved Cornelius Ashford before Elspeth had. The woman he had married first. The woman whose son was about to change everything. Velmore Hall was smaller than Thornmere in every dimension, shorter, quieter, less impressed with itself, and it was, in the most specific and irreducible sense, more of a home. The difference was visible the moment she stepped through the gate. The garden, though November bare, had been shaped with the intelligence of someone who tended it for love rather than display. The trained rose along the east wall still carrying the memory of its summer in the graceful arch of its canes. The stonework was pointed and kept without vanity, not performing maintenance, simply performing care. The lamp at the gate had been lit before the carriage arrived because someone inside had been watching the road and had risen, quietly, to make sure that the person coming through the dark would not arrive into darkness. Elspeth stood a moment on the lane and looked at this house her husband had maintained for 30 years without telling her it existed, and felt something she had not prepared herself to feel, not rage, not betrayal, though she had already processed as much as such things can be processed at speed, but something quieter. A recognition. This house had been cared for. It had been genuinely, consistently, lovingly cared for. And whoever had spent 30 years doing the caring had done it well. She walked toward the door. And the door opened before she reached it. The woman who opened the door herself, not leaving it to the maid but coming with a lamp, in the manner of someone for whom welcome is a personal act rather than a household function. Was not what Elspeth had been armored against, though she could not have said with precision what she had been armored against. Rosalind Farrow was approximately 50, with dark hair laced with white and eyes of a deep, still brown, moorland water at the end of summer, quiet on the surface, not shallow beneath. She wore plain dark blue wool, without jewelry, without pretension. She held herself with a stillness that Elspeth recognized immediately and involuntarily. It was the same stillness she herself had spent 40 years cultivating. The posture of a person who has lived with difficulty long enough to have made her peace with carrying it. She held the lamp slightly to one side and its light fell across both of their faces at once, and for a moment weighted with everything it contained, the two women simply looked at each other. Everything that had connected them and everything that had divided them was arranged invisibly in that doorway, between the lamplight and the dark. Then Rosalind stepped back and held the door wide. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, her eyes not quite. "Please come in out of the cold. I have been waiting 30 years to say certain things to you, and I should very much like to say them now." Elspeth stepped across the threshold. Behind her the Yorkshire knight. Before her, everything she had not been told. The parlour of Velmora Hall was warm in the way Thornmere's rooms had never been warm, not because the fire was larger, it was modest, but because the room was inhabited rather than managed. A well-worn Persian rug before the hearth, its red faded to the comfortable depth of a color that has had time to become itself. Books along one wall, their spines soft with genuine use. A vase of bronze chrysanthemums on the mantel, late, nearly done, holding their petals by the decision of flowers in a warm room. And on the wall near the window, a small collection of framed drawings. A child's work, 7 or 8 years of age, the earnest and imprecise work of a child who draws not because he has been instructed to but because he wants to capture something. A horse slightly too large for its legs. A tree with a house behind it. A figure standing beside the house, tall, broad in the shoulder, one hand raised in the approximation of a wave. Elspeth looked at these drawings for precisely as long as she could before she looked away. She had spent 40 years looking at painted portraits of Cornelius's ancestors, formal, composed, at a distance. She had never, in 40 years, seen a drawing made by a child who wanted to draw his father. She sat in the chair Rosalind indicated and accepted the tea and held it in both hands and felt its warmth through her gloves and waited, because waiting was still her particular skill. But tonight, for the first time, she was waiting for the truth rather than for another careful half of it. He came from the hallway at 8:30, a young man of 28, straight-backed, composed, wearing a plain dark coat with the ease of someone who dresses for himself and no one else. He entered the room with a quality that Elspeth had spent 40 years cataloguing and had never found a precise word for. The gravitational presence of a person who occupies a space by simply being in it, without effort, without performance. He had dark hair, precisely kept. A still, direct manner. And when he looked at Elspeth, directly, without the social slide and recover of a person uncertain of their welcome, she was struck before she could prepare herself to be struck. The jaw. That specific line, slightly squared at the corner, that she had looked at across the breakfast table for 4 decades. The hands. He reached out in greeting and she saw them, long-fingered, precise, the ring finger fractionally longer than the middle, which had been specific to Cornelius and which she had noticed when he wrote, when he held a book, when he held her hand in the garden on the last June evening when everything had been nearly said and nothing had. Edmund Farrow took her hand and said, with a formality calibrated so precisely to hers that it might have been practiced or might have been inherited, "Your Grace, I have wished to meet you for as long as I have known you existed. That has been my entire life." Elspeth held his hand one moment longer than necessary before releasing it. "I believe," she said carefully, "that you have your father's hands." He looked down at them. "I have been told," he said quietly, "that I have rather more of him than that." A silence. And then, from the mantelpiece, Rosalind reached behind the chrysanthemums and withdrew a folded document. And the room changed. "Before any question of estate or legal claim is discussed," Rosalind said, placing the document on the table between them with the quiet finality of a person who has been rehearsing this moment for 30 years and is going to do it properly. "I must tell you something I have wished to tell you since the first year of your marriage. Not because it serves any legal purpose. Because you have a right to know it. And because silence, however kindly authorized, remains a form of dishonesty." She sat. She looked at Elspeth directly, and Elspeth looked back, and between them the document lay on the table, worn at the creases, the paper softened by years of careful keeping, in the manner of something regularly taken out and held and then folded away again. "Cornelius and I were married," Rosalind said. The fire crackled. "In the spring of 1848, at the church of St. Cuthbert in Oswald Kirk, 6 miles from here. This is a certified extract from the parish register. It is genuine. It is witnessed. And Edmund," she paused, and the pause was 30 years long, "Edmund was born within that marriage. 7 months before it was dissolved. Your Grace." She looked at Elspeth with the expression of a woman who has set down the heaviest thing she has ever carried and does not yet know whether the floor will hold. "He is legitimate. He is the rightful heir to Thornmere. And you have been owed this truth for 40 years. Outside on the moor, the wind moved through the moorland grass with a sound like turning pages. Inside the parlor no one moved. No one spoke. The fire burned. And the world that Elspeth Ashford had spent 40 years inside rearranged itself completely, quietly, and without apology. Married. He had been married before. And the son he never told her about was legitimate. Which meant everything Percival Ashford had claimed that morning was built on a lie Cornelius had never corrected. And someone was about to correct it. Rosalind told the story simply. She had learned, in 30 years of carrying it, that it did not need embellishment, that accuracy was all it required, and that accuracy, in this case, was more than sufficient to break a listener's heart. She had been a governess in 1847, employed in a household near Helmsley, when Cornelius Ashford had been a guest for the shooting season. She was 26, he was 31. What had passed between them she would not dress in poetry. It had been real and serious, and by autumn he had asked her to marry him. She had understood what it meant. The gap between them in every worldly measure was enormous, but she had loved him, and he had asked her, and the marriage at Oswald Kirk in March of 1848 had been conducted with 2 witnesses and no announcement, and all the gravity of 2 people doing something they understood could not survive the scrutiny of the world in which he lived, and who had married anyway, because the alternative was to be cautious with something that did not deserve caution. Edmund was born in September of 1849. Those were the best years of her life, she said, without embellishment, without performance, as a plain and irrefutable fact. Cornelius had come to Thornmere every month. He had been different here. She did not elaborate because she did not need to, because Elspeth understood, with the specific understanding of a woman who had spent 40 years with the same man, precisely the differentness she meant. He had been himself here. And that self was the man Rosalind had loved. And it was, Elspeth thought, also the man she had loved. Which was the most complicated thing she had felt all evening. In the spring of 1850 the world arrived at Thornmere. It arrived in the form of the Duke's mother and her solicitors, efficient, implacable, armed with the full authority of class and money and generational expectation. And its message was simple. This marriage would end one way or another, and the only question was whether it ended quietly and privately or publicly and expensively and with maximum damage to every person in it, including the infant Edmund. Cornelius had come to Thornmere that April and he had wept. That was Rosalind's most devastating detail, delivered without drama, that this composed, private, carefully managed man had wept, in the manner of a man who has exhausted every other mode of address and found only this one remaining. He had promised Thornmere, his to give from his own private inheritance. He had promised Edmund's education, his provision, everything for the duration of his life. The ecclesiastical annulment was arranged through channels Mr. Croft managed, on grounds of concealment, without requiring Rosalind to appear or to contest it. And then, and here Rosalind's voice did not break but there was something in it that had the quality of controlled weather, Cornelius Ashford went back to London, and in the spring of 1851 he went to Bath, and in the spring of 1852 he married Elspeth Vane, and the two halves of his life were established and separated and maintained until they were not. "He told me about you," Rosalind said, looking at Elspeth now. "That first winter after Bath. He wrote to me about you. He said you were the most surprising person he had met since me." Elspeth listened. She did not interrupt. She did not look away. She watched Rosalind's face throughout the telling. The steadiness of it, the absence of accusation, the quality of a woman who has taken what was done to her and built out of it not bitterness, which would have been easier and more understandable, but a life. A genuine, inhabited, chosen life, full of a garden and a son and 30 years of independent dignity in a house on the edge of a moor. And she found, beneath the grief and the fury and the extraordinary strangeness of the evening, a sensation she had not anticipated, something close to recognition. They had both loved the same man. Both had lived in the shadows he could not illuminate. Both had managed what he could not manage and carried what he could not carry and been, each in her own way, better to him than he had deserved. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, something significant. The specific solidarity of two women who have survived the same man's limitations, and who are now for the first time in the same room together, and can look at each other without the obstacle of him between them. "Did you hate him?" Elspeth asked. Not as an accusation. As a genuine question from one woman to another who has earned the right to answer it honestly. Rosalind considered it fully. "For a time," she said. "And then Edmund needed me more than anger did. And then I was sorry for him. He was a man shaped entirely by his world's expectations, who could love beyond them but could not act beyond them. The gap between what he felt and what he could do was where all his failures lived." She looked at Elspeth. "I believe, Your Grace, that you know that gap very well." Edmund said that he had known of the Duchess of Thornmere since childhood. His mother had told him everything, the exact inversion of the education Cornelius had provided his wife, and the comparison arrived in Elspeth's chest with the specific weight of a thing she had suspected and now had confirmed. He had known there was a woman at Thornmere bearing the title that by law should have been his mother's, who did not know he existed, managing a life in a house full of secrets she had not been given the means to unlock. He had carried this knowledge with the specific difficulty of a person who holds a truth they cannot act upon, watching it gain weight year by year, unable to set it down and unable to carry it comfortably. Then, 8 months before the Duke's death, a letter had arrived at Velmera in Cornelius's own hand, addressed to Edmund personally for the first time in his life. It had said, "I am dying. I've been a coward. I would like, before I go, to believe that the two women I have failed most in my life might know each other, and might perhaps understand each other better than I deserved." The letter had also said, and here Edmund's composure briefly did what composure does at the edges. It held, but only just, "I am proud of you." The only time he had ever said so. Edmund kept the letter in the drawer of the writing table in this room. "He asked me," Edmund said, "if I would let you come." He looked at her steadily. "I said yes, without hesitation." He paused. "I had only ever wanted," and then his eyes moved sharply to the window. And the sound arrived. Carriage wheels on the stone lane. Not one carriage. Two. Moving at the deliberate pace of a vehicle that has found its destination and has no intention of being polite about it. The lamp glow swept the garden wall. 4 lamps, not 2. Edmund was at the window before anyone spoke. Elspeth was beside him a moment later. Through the rain-blurred glass, the first carriage halting at the gate, a tall narrow figure descending in a black coat, and even at this distance, in this light, in this rain, she knew him. The easy, calculated composure. The hat at its characteristic careful angle. The way he moved through a space as though it had already been reassigned to him. Percival. Beside him, clutching a leather case against the rain, Mr. Renwick. Behind them both, 2 men of the broad and purposeful type that one retains for situations in which legal argument alone is considered insufficient. How did he know? Edmund asked, quietly, quickly, already assessing. "I had a watcher at the inn," Elspeth said. "He will have reported the direction." She looked at the table, the register extract, the teacups, the letter in her coat, Mr. Croft's documents. She looked at Rosalind. She looked at Edmund. For one still moment, the 3 of them stood together in the warm parlor with the cold world pressing against the windows, and the fire crackled, and the lamp glow swept across the wall again, and then, with the quiet, shared understanding of people who have individually spent their lives managing what was done to them, and have now, together, decided to stop, they moved. All three. At once. The same direction. Toward the door. Percival Ashford had arrived at Velmora Hall with a solicitor, 2 hired men, and 30 years of expectations. He had not arrived prepared for what was in that parlor. He had not arrived prepared for Mrs. Harriet Dunmore. Percival Ashford did not knock. He had, over the course of his 41 years, developed the particular confidence of a man for whom doors have always opened, not because he forces them but because he has learned to move toward them with enough certainty that they open before anyone thinks to question whether they should. He came through the front door of Velmora Hall before the maid had properly completed opening it, crossed the entrance hall with his solicitor a half-pace behind and his 2 men at the diplomatic distance of people retained his emphasis, and surveyed the parlor with the rapid, cataloguing eye of a man taking inventory of a room he intends to own by morning. His gaze moved, Mr. Croft, Edmund, Rosalind, Elspeth. When it reached Elspeth it paused a fraction of a second, the faintest register of surprise, swiftly managed, before settling into the expression she had seen across 100 dinner tables at Thornmere, gracious on the surface, nothing warm in it anywhere. "Your Grace," he said, "I had rather hoped you would have the wisdom to return to Wiltshire. It appears you have decided to make this considerably more complicated than it needed to be." The room was very still. "It was already complicated," said Elspeth, in the tone she reserved for situations that required composure to be weaponized rather than merely maintained. "You simply were not in possession of all its components." Percival looked at the table, at the documents on it, at Mr. Croft's case. His eyes did not change, which meant they changed exactly as much as he intended. "Mr. Renwick," he said, "if you please." Mr. Renwick produced his documents and presented the argument in 3 clean parts, in the manner of a man who has been preparing this specific speech since that afternoon and believes the preparation sufficient. First, the deed of transfer held by Mr. Croft was legally incomplete without registration, and an unregistered deed, regardless of signature or intent, remained challengeable as an expression of intention rather than a completed transfer of title. Second, no validly lodged secondary will or codicil existed, and the public will read at Thornmere that mourning was therefore the operative document of record. Third, delivered with the care of a man placing his strongest card, any claim by the young man in this room was without legal foundation, because the annulment of the prior marriage, whatever its timing, had severed the line of legitimacy, and Edmund Farrow was by established record a natural son rather than a legitimate heir. Percival listened to all of it with the expression of a man observing a procedure he has approved in advance. When Renwick concluded, he looked at Elspeth with something arranged to resemble regret. "I should very much prefer," he said in the tone of a man who prefers everything to go the way he has planned, "that this conclude without further distress to any party." 3 seconds of silence. Then Edmund stepped forward from behind the table. He was not loud. He was the opposite of loud, which in that room was considerably more powerful. "Then," he said, "you should have stayed in Wiltshire." And before Percival could respond, there was a knock at the door. The maid opened it, and there in the doorway, her traveling coat dark with the rain of a 300-mile journey, her gray hair somewhat disordered by urgency, her expression the expression of a woman who has made a decision and driven it across England and intends it to count, stood Mrs. Harriet Dunmore. 68 years old. Housekeeper of Thornmere House for 45 years. She carried a satchel against her chest with both hands, the way one carries something fragile or precious or both, and she stood in the doorway with the authority of a woman who has spent her entire professional life being correct about what was needed and is arriving now at the moment when she gets to say so in public. She looked at Elspeth first. Just for a moment, a warm, steady look that said everything it needed to say and nothing more. Then she looked at Percival Ashford, and in the careful, calibrated tone of a woman who has observed the precise usage of titles for 45 years and understands their power, she said, "Good evening, Mr. Ashford." "Mr. Ashford." Not your soon-to-be Grace. Not even a nod toward the presumption. Just, "Mr. Ashford," said with the finality of someone closing an account. Percival stared at her. The two hired men shifted their weight. Mr. Renwick looked at his documents. Mrs. Dunmore turned to Mr. Croft and set the satchel on the table with both hands. "I have brought," she said, "what you require." What Mrs. Dunmore had carried through the night from Wiltshire, retrieved from the locked cabinet in her personal quarters before anyone thought to prevent her, a cabinet whose key she had worn around her neck since 1862 on the Duke's own private instruction, was a certified extract from the parish register of St. Cuthbert, Oswald Kirk, bearing the parish seal, the witness signatures, the officiating clergyman's mark, recording the marriage of Cornelius Edmund Ashford to Rosalind Mary Garside, on the 12th of March, 1848, and beside it, from the same cabinet, the Ecclesiastical Court's formal certification of annulment, dated the 22nd of March, 1850. Mr. Croft took both documents and read them with the focused speed of a man reading something he has long suspected existed but has never, until this moment, seen. The room was very quiet. Percival watched Mr. Croft's face with the attention of a man who has learned to read other men's faces at the moment of reversal, and what he read in Mr. Croft's face was what none of his 30 years of planning had prepared him for. Not doubt, not hesitation, but the specific stillness of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for and is now organizing what comes next. "Edmund Cornelius Farrow," said Mr. Croft in a voice of exact and deliberate calm, "was born the 7th of September 1849, within a lawful, valid, undissolved marriage. The annulment was not finalized until the 22nd of March 1850. He was born legitimate. He remains legitimate. His claim to the title and estates of the Duke of Thornmere supersedes, by every applicable standard of law, any bequest made to a collateral relation. The fire. The wind on the moor. Nothing else." Percival's composure held for 8 seconds. Elspeth counted them. Then it did not hold, and what was beneath it was not the cold calculation she had braced herself for but something rawer and more human and in its way more satisfying. The specific, boyish fury of a man who has been absolutely certain of something for a very long time and has arrived at the hour of its achievement to find it already gone. He turned to Mr. Renwick, who was examining the annulment certificate with the expression of a man who has spent the last 30 seconds looking for an error and has not found one and is beginning to understand that he will not. "We contest it," Percival said. His voice was still precise, but the precision had the quality of a thing being maintained by effort rather than composure. "Every detail through the courts. The register, the timing, the witnesses. It will take years and it will be expensive and at the end of it we will contest it," said Edmund, "from outside this house." He stepped forward from the table and he was not tall and he was not loud and he was not performing certainty, which was the thing that made it work, because certainty that needs to be performed is not certainty at all, and what Edmund Farrow had, standing in the parlor of Velmora Hall on a November night in 1891, was the specific, quiet, unperformable certainty of a man who has known his whole life what belonged to him and has simply, finally, decided to stand in front of it. He looked at Percival Ashford with his father's eyes set in a younger face and his mother's composure running beneath it like bedrock. "You are welcome to contest it," he said. "You are not welcome in this house." 8 seconds. Then Percival walked back across the garden to his carriage, and the door of Velmora Hall closed behind him. Percival was gone. The documents were real. The case was sound. But the hardest part of that night was not the confrontation at the door. It was what came after, when the house was quiet and the fire was low and two women sat alone on either side of a hearth with nothing left between them but the truth. The sound of Percival's carriage retreating down the stone lane and disappearing into the dark of the moor was, Elspeth decided, the finest sound she had heard in 3 days. He had not argued further. He had looked at Edmund one last time with the expression of a man absorbing a loss he had not prepared for and walking away from it rather than from the room, which was perhaps the most honest thing Percival Ashford had done in years. The gate at the end of the lane swung shut. The sound of hooves and wheels diminished into the dark. Silence came back. Mr. Croft laid his documents flat on the table and began outlining, in his precise and patient manner, the work that lay ahead. The petition to the College of Arms for formal recognition of the title, the challenge to the public will through the Court of Probate, the registration of the Velmora deed in Elspeth's name, 30 years late but legal at last. The work would take months. Elspeth sat and listened and understood that months of work, known, shapeable, soluble, was not the same as 40 years of locked rooms, and that she had been surviving something considerably worse than paperwork for a very long time. When Mr. Croft finished and went to his room, and Edmund took his candle to attend to correspondence with the conscientiousness of a man who has just inherited a great deal and understands that the world will not stop requiring his attention, the parlor went quiet. And Elspeth and Rosalind sat on either side of the fire, and the last of everything unnecessary between them dissolved. They sat without speaking for a time, which was the specific comfort of two people who have spent too much of their lives speaking carefully and find, in each other's company, a permission to say nothing. The fire burned low. The moor outside the window was silent in the way moors are silent, absolute, without apology. "I owe you an apology," Rosalind said at last. "I knew of you from the first year of your marriage. I knew what you did not know. I kept his silence because he asked me to, and because I was afraid of what disclosure would do to Edmund. Those are reasons. They are not justifications. You deserve to know. I chose his comfort over your right, and I have no comfortable accounting of that." Elspeth looked at the fire. Outside, the wind moved through the moorland grass, that turning pages sound that had been following her all evening. She thought of the booty in the library, the key on the dressing table, the garden bench and the hand and the thumb moving across her knuckles just once. "He made us both carry what he could not carry himself," she said. "And the question I have been sitting with tonight is whether I let that make me angry at you, or whether I let it make me," she paused and found the word, and it surprised her slightly, grateful. She looked at Rosalind. "You raised his son with honesty. You told Edmund everything. You gave him what Cornelius never managed to give anyone, the truth while you were still alive to give it. I'm not angry at you, Rosalind. I'm very tired of being angry at him. And I think," she added after a moment, "that I would like, if you are willing, to begin a different kind of acquaintance. One that he does not have to be present for." In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings moved with the velocity that good evidence and the right advocate generate when combined correctly and aimed at the truth. The public will was challenged in the court of probate. The certified extract from St. Cuthbert's was authenticated by two independent ecclesiastical historians, both of whom found it unimpeachable. The annulment certificate's date was verified against the court records at York. Edmund Cornelius Farrow was formally recognized as the Sixth Duke of Thornmere in the first week of February, an outcome that arrived by post on a morning of hard frost when the moor outside was white and still, and Edmund read it at the breakfast table with a composure that held for approximately 30 seconds before Rosalind reached across and took his hand, and the composure, briefly, privately, in the company of two women who understood exactly what the letter meant, let go. Percival Ashford did not contest the proceedings. The deed of Velmora Hall was registered in Elspeth's name on the 14th of January. When the confirmation arrived, a plain, administrative, beautifully dry document, she held it in her hands for a moment before setting it down, and she felt the paper with the specific reverence one feels for simple things that have been a very long time in arriving. It was hers. It had always been meant to be hers. It had simply required her to come and get it. Spring came to Velmora with the particular honesty of a season arriving in a place that has earned it. The hawthorn opened white along the stone lane in late April, carrying that cold and warmth scent that is the smell of the season beginning its actual work. The kitchen garden showed rows of early green against the turned dark soil. Rosalind's doing, begun in March despite the frost, the work of a woman who has been tending this ground for 30 years and knows precisely when it is ready to receive. Mrs. Dunmore arrived from Wiltshire in April with 2 trunks and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for permission to leave for a great many years, and she installed herself in the housekeeper's room at Velmora with a competence that made the existing staff briefly apprehensive and then, within a week, deeply grateful. Edmund visited on the first Thursday of every month without fail. 4 days, always books. One for Elspeth, one for Rosalind, one he had read on the journey and wished to argue about. He stayed for dinner on the last evening of each visit, and the conversation at that table was the best conversation Elspeth had encountered in years. The kind that is both learning and teaching at once, the kind that requires no performance, the kind that is possible only between people who have stopped pretending to be simpler than they are. The Sixth Duke of Thornmere said what he meant out loud while he was still alive to say it. This, Elspeth thought, watching him across the supper table on an April evening with the moor gold through the window, was what it should have looked like all along. This was the family Cornelius had always meant to build. He had simply never managed to put it in the same room. On the last evening of May, when the light over the moor held gold until nearly 9 o'clock and the walled garden of Velmera was warm enough to sit in after supper, Elspeth Ashford sat alone in the stone garden chair with a pen and paper and wrote the letter she had been composing, in one form or another, for 40 years. She wrote it quickly and without revision, not because it was simple but because the thinking was done. She wrote about Bath, the pump room, the dropped Virgil, the look from the doorway. She wrote about the locked room and the booty and the key placed and taken back, and 40 years of October absences managed with a dignity that had cost her more than anyone had known or been permitted to witness. She wrote about Cornelius, about what he had been and what he had failed to be, and about her hard-won understanding that a person can be genuinely both, and that understanding this is not the same as excusing it. And at the very end she wrote, "I loved you imperfectly because I was given imperfect information. Had I known everything, I believe I would have loved you still, only more honestly and for considerably less cost to myself." She folded the letter. She carried it to the iron brazier at the garden's edge and set it alight. She held it by one corner and watched it take, and she let it go when the flame reached her fingers. The ash rose into the warm May air, dark motes against a sky the color of old gold, and drifted out over the moor and dispersed and became the air itself and were gone. The garden was warm. Through the open window she heard Rosalind moving in the kitchen, and Mrs. Dunmore's low voice in the passage, and the sound of a door opened and closed by someone who knows it well enough not to think about the opening. These are the sounds of a life inhabited rather than managed. She had not known such sounds for a long time. She lifted her face to the evening light and took a long, unhurried breath. The weight, the 40 years of it, the silences and the shadows and the faithful, costly, quietly magnificent love, was gone. What remained was simpler than any word she had for it. She was here. The evening was warm. The moor was gold. She owned this house. She had earned this quiet. And she was, for the first time since a lamplit garden in Bath in the year 1851, on the evening when a man had looked back from a doorway and she had not looked away, entirely, completely, and irrevocably free. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. We read every single one. What part of the story caught your attention? Tell us in the comments. And if you have not yet subscribed to the Duke's Shadow, do so now, and never miss another Victorian romance that will break your heart and put it back together again. Like, subscribe. Come back tomorrow.